we gather here with the wisdom of Lutheran pastors. So if one goes from the gospel to the first reading, you see that there's wisdom and you get it or you don't get it and it's a gift. And I thought, well, that's not particularly helpful. Then you go to the second reading and you sort of get this permission letter back from Paul to Timothy about the slave Onesimus. And I thought, well, that's not really helpful either. And so then you go to the gospel and you say, well, that's not really helpful either. But I will return to the gospel. I want to say something first in reference to Dorian and Brent Lowe, who maybe none of you know. I want to say something more about the gospel, and then return to our date of September 8th. All this week we've been hearing so much about Dorian, and I'd like to submit to you this, that really in the end, we shouldn't remember Dorian at all. We should remember Brent Lowe. Does anybody know who Brent Lowe is? I'm hoping no one, but maybe someone's clever. All right, let me tell the story of Brent Lowe. Brent Lowe is a 49-year-old man in the Bahamas. Till a few days ago, he lived in a simple cement house on one of the islands. The Hurricane Dorian hit. Mr. Lowe soon had company. His homes were demolished. Desperate neighbors and relatives sought shelter with him in that concrete home. But as the hours ticked by, they sat in the living room and waited. And outside, it was getting worse. The wind hit 185 miles an hour as the rain pummeled the island. Mr. Lowe could not but hear the roof lifting off his house and slowly slapping back down. His neighbors knew they had to go. So finally, one by one, they stepped outside, braving the storm to find shelter somewhere else. Mr. Lowe was one of the last to leave, and for a good reason. Brent Lowe was blind. But that wasn't all. He had someone else to worry about. His 24-year-old son. His son has cerebral palsy. He cannot walk. As the storm raged outside, his son lay hidden in the house, curled in the bathtub. When the time came, the young man's father did the only thing he could do. He lifted his son and put him on his shoulders and stepped outside and off his front porch. What he discovered shocked him. His street was flooded. The water came up to his chin. But his neighbors were waiting for him. Grabbing onto them, Brent Lowe made his way through the waters and the wind to the nearest house, 5 minutes away. He would recount that it was the most terrifying 5 minutes of his life. He and his son survived. They eventually made it to Nassau in safety, where Mr. Lowe was able to receive his regular dialysis treatment, and his son is now with relatives. Resilience, courage, focus beyond belief, choosing not to fear or doubt, but to follow what you need to do. That is the mark of discipleship. There was no room for anything else, I'm sure, in Brent Lowe's mind than moving forward. It didn't matter that the water's up to his chin. It didn't matter that I suspect his son was heavy. It didn't matter that the winds were still blowing. It didn't matter. There were no excuses to be made. What was to be done was clear, direct, and empowered him to do such. Resilience and courage. In light of one human experience. We hear our gospel today, and was referenced, hating other things. It really, as was said, is not this emotional experience. It's about recognizing a state of what St. Ignatius would call holy indifference. Saying that I can keep myself in a position where neither one of these is going to unduly influence me until I am clear God's will. I am not the deciding agent. I am the receiving agent. I am the receptor of God's grace in all ways at all times. And so the goal is to become open. The goal is to become transparent. The goal is to become the vessel, the earthen vessel that God will fill. And yes, it is about fullness of dedication. I can assure you, I would be a very rich man if I had a quarter for every time at my school I said, focus, pay attention. Very rich. But that's what the gospel's doing. Is it a slap in the face? Yes. So again, how do you got to rectify that with the Ten Commandments? Honor your mother and your father. And now you hear, hate mother and father. And you're like, what's going on here? It was designed to be as shocking to the people as possible. To say, not that you should not honor your mother and your father, but to recognize all is to be done with that singularity of focus and purpose of discipleship. Saying it has been given as gift, and God is present in grace, inviting me as his daughter and son to follow, to put one foot in front of the other, even though no light is seen, even though the winds are howling, even though the water might be up to my neck. Choosing not to fear. And it's not so much about making a plan to build, a plan to sue for peace. It's about recognizing that fullness of God dwelling within. And stuff gets in the way. We may not want it to, but it does. And it does over and over and over again. Whether we are on the outside or on the inside, the sisters and so many will tell you the monastery is the least likely place to escape the pressures of the world. Right? At least I get a chorus from the back, so that's helpful. And so we're all called to that. To purify ourselves, to recognize it as gift, not to be held on to and clung to, and not to fall in love more with the creature than the Creator. And it happens all the time. The shorthand things are, let me look through your bank statement for the last year, and I will tell you what you value. You don't need to say a word. I'll just look, and I'll see where you spent it, and that will reveal your values. Might be a helpful exercise to say, where do I spend what money I have? Take the clock and do the same thing. Where do I spend my time? What do we think about? What do we daydream about? What do we hope for? What occupies our thoughts? Is it this call to discipleship? Is this a real challenge, which I think it is for me, and perhaps for you, to focus? To say it is about God. I wanted to find a human example because it would be easy for me to say, okay, well, let's take Mother Teresa. Okay, and we could go through that whole story. But as you know, in her final spiritual journal, she talked about the incredible darkness and the sense of the waters up to her chin without the presence of God. You're like, oh, it's not as clear and as easy for the saint as you thought it would be. Or we could pick, whatever. Maximum Kolbe is always a good person too. So he gives his life that the man can live in the concentration camps. We celebrated his feast day a few weeks ago. Okay, they're all saints. It's easy for them because they're saints. Really? The date, September 8th. Because it's a Sunday, okay, we suppress sort of the regular calendar, but it's the birthday of Mary. So it's the question, we're celebrating biology because we picked December 8th as the Immaculate Conception, and it's now 9 months later, so obviously we have to recognize this was the day that she was born on. As the biologist in me, it doesn't always work in 9 months, and as all the moms in the group can tell you, it doesn't exactly work in 9 months. But in any case, we'll celebrate biology then. Well, you could say, well, for Mary it was easy because it was an Immaculate Conception. She was conceived without sin. Okay. Were you or were you not baptized. And if you were, at that exact moment, you were exactly the same as Mary, without sin. So now what's the difference? What is it that happened from that point forward in Mary's experience and in our experience? I would argue it's singularity of focus. This ability to intuit and be present in an extraordinary, all-encompassing way with the love and will of God. And we too have the same invitation and the same two possibilities by our baptism. And so it's not just the stuff of saints. It's not just for Mary. Well, that was easy for her. I'm not so convinced it was. So it's okay that it's hard, and we're to pick up that cross and follow. And it's not supposed to, although could it be? Sure, but to be so easy, it certainly wasn't easy for Mr. Lowe to not see and to be struck by that. And even though there's voices and people around him, what an extraordinary risk. What an extraordinary resilience and courage. What a singular focus. Focus this day on the Creator and not the creation. And be transformed again and renewed by your baptism to know that as Mary was born today, we have that opportunity to be reborn this day. Nothing about Dorian. In the end, nothing about Brent Lowe. In the end, nothing about you. Nothing about me. Nothing about Mary. Only about Jesus Christ.